Well, hey everybody, it's Sandy and welcome back to my channel dedicated to helping you advocate for your own health one topic at a time. So guys, today I got a few things to talk about. We're going to talk about ivermectin, the Delta variant, the vaccines, you name it. It's going to be a little bit chatty. And so as usual, I want to say thank you and welcome. Welcome to my new subscribers. Welcome to my subscribers who've been with me for a while. If you find my content helpful and you haven't subscribed, I really hope you'll do so. And for those of you who want to be notified every time I put up a video, it's not sufficient to click subscribe, but you also have to click the bell. Yeah, so guys, I got to thinking about this video because I had the honor of being invited to be on a panel for a group Zoom call that included healthcare providers. They were mostly physicians, really from all over the United States and South America. And I got invited onto this panel, I believe it was because Dr. Juan Suarez is also, who was a panelist. Some of you might remember I did a couple of different videos interviewing Dr. Juan Suarez. He is a doctor in Orlando, Florida, also works throughout the United States via telehealth, and was prescribing ivermectin very early on in this pandemic and really was one of the first people using it. I'm going to link one of those videos here. I also think I'm going to have Dr. Suarez on again in the very near future as a guest on my channel so that we can talk some more about where we are in the pandemic, because things have changed a lot. Right now, well, I personally still see a role for ivermectin. It was never not controversial, so it's controversial now. It was controversial then. You can watch the previous videos that I've done on this when I interviewed Dr. Suarez, but given that ivermectin is such a benign drug and it's used so commonly in the third world, it's used in elderly people, it's even used in children who have cases of head lice, it's a very safe drug. I think it does have a role. Now, I think that's changed a lot since we have vaccines, because in my opinion, vaccines are the heavy hitters. But as you know, in a lot of other countries, and there were other people from all over Latin America on this call, there might have been people from other countries besides that, they don't all have vaccines. I think for places that in absence of the vaccine, there's no doubt in my mind that ivermectin should have a role there. Now, I'm also going to put down in the description box a link to the FLCCC, which is the Frontline COVID Critical Care Alliance, FLCCC Alliance. I personally think the FLCCC Alliance has done a good job at bringing ivermectin to the attention of the public. You know, it became really apparent to me during this Zoom meeting that there are some misconceptions, and it just really, the whole meeting drove the point home to me, which I've mentioned on my channel before. I think it's so unfortunate that COVID became so politicized. And I think I'm very much a centrist. I mean, we all think of ourselves as centrists, I guess, right? But I don't want to get into politics on this channel at all. But I see right and I see wrong on both ends of the political spectrum. And unfortunately, everything is just such a package deal. So it just sort of seems that if you're in this group, like I am, where you think there's a really important role that ivermectin can play, then maybe you're also in this group where there's some misunderstandings about some other aspects of the disease or its treatment. And I at the risk of sounding a little bit arrogant, which I don't want to do, and I just think it's all I could do is, as a panelist, I tried very hard to respond to those things, you know, in a way that I thought was thoughtful and respectful, and without dismissing what I heard other people say or whatever I was commenting on or responding to, because I think we all have to meet people where they are. And I'm actually just going to take this moment to get on a tangent here. For those of you who haven't checked out the Sandy's DIY Health Advocacy Facebook group, you can get on Facebook, ask to join that group. And there was recently a little banter in there. I kind of ignored it. I didn't weigh in the group, and I debated about putting a post up. But I do think this should extend to the Facebook group as well. I think that we can all disagree on things, and we can still be very polite to each other and respectful to each other. I don't think it's necessary to call people names, to call someone a child or call somebody ignorant, whatever it is. I'm just kind of pulling that out of the air. But I did see some of that, and I was a little disappointed about it. And I did see some people said things like that they wanted the group to be a place for an exchange of good, trustworthy information, and people shouldn't spread false information. And you know, the problem with that is I don't see myself as the arbiter of truth. And I don't think, therefore, my Facebook group's page is going to be the arbiter of truth. I think the only way to get to the truth is to have an honest exchange of ideas. And, you know, people have the right then to, figure out where they belong. If you're going to be a critical listener and flush out inconsistencies so that you can get to the right answer, you will. And if not, that's going to be your issue. You know, you own your own rights, and then you also own the consequences. You have your own choices, you also have the consequences. So yeah, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I'm just hoping that that was a one-time thing in the Facebook group, because I'm not ever going to kick somebody out of the group because I disagree with them or I think they don't understand something. I will do my best to explain, you know, what I think and why I'm there. But I don't want people being mean or rude or anything like that. So anyway, I had a chance to practice what I preach when I was on this Zoom call, because I vehemently disagreed with lots of things that I had heard on there. And I agreed with other things. I agreed with a lot of things, probably more than I disagreed with. So what I want to do today is just talk about the couple things that came up that I felt I really needed to respond to, because I feel that there's real misunderstanding about this. And I've probably mentioned some of this before or partially in one video or another. So for those of you who have been following me for a while, if it's a little redundant, you'll forgive me. But so item number one came in the form of a question for the panelists. And it said, I have been told that spike proteins can be shed. So I could be affected by somebody next to me who's recently been vaccinated and is shedding spike proteins. So first of all, spike proteins themselves are not shed. The spike protein is what you make when you are vaccinated. That's how the immune system is trained by the vaccine. You manufacture the spike protein. The messenger RNA has the recipe for the spike protein. It gives it to the ribosomes in the cells. The cells produce the spike proteins. Your body gets a look at it. It's foreign. You get the next shot and the body says, oh, I remember this, and it responds, and you build immunity so that if you were ever to come in contact with the virus, your immune system would recognize that piece of the virus, that is the spike protein. Now, let's say for the sake of argument that you did shed spike proteins, which you don't, but let's say for the sake of argument that we shed spike proteins after vaccination. The thing is, the spike protein is not sufficient to make you sick. You need the entire virus to invade your cells to make you sick, because the spike protein is just one part of that virus. But the virus has all kinds of other parts, and they work together just like our cells work together. Our cells have different components in them that talk to each other and communicate. You need the whole virus so that it can invade the cells, give the instructions to the cells for it to replicate itself, that the virus hijacks your own cells and it replicates. And that's when you start to get ill, is when you start to shed. That can't happen without the whole virus. So I explained it as best I could on the Zoom call, and I decided to take the opportunity to explain that here as well for anybody listening who's wondering about this concept of shedding spike proteins. The second issue, and I know I've touched on this at various times, but I want to make a real point of it this time, and that is mortality rate as it relates to the decision about vaccination, or anything else for that matter. I hear people a lot talk about the mortality rate being what it is, and it's very low these days. The mortality rate with COVID is exceedingly low. And they say, well, I am 40 or I'm 50, I'm healthy, you know, whatever, I'm likely to survive. And therefore, it's not worth the risk of the vaccine. And by the way, I completely appreciate and share concerns about vaccines. I'm personally very impressed with the messenger RNA technology, but I had concerns getting the vaccine. I got shingles right after my second Moderna shot. I understand that vaccines aren't perfect, and I understand that there have been some complications, as there are with any vaccines. My point here is that the overfocus on mortality is distracting us from morbidity. If the only issue were mortality with this disease, we probably wouldn't have vaccines at all, or maybe we would only be giving them to people over 80 years old, because most of us aren't going to die. But there is a huge bell curve of survivors. Surviving COVID doesn't mean you've recovered from COVID, and recovery can be a long time. I think that if the message could be tweaked so that the focus is really on the morbidity and not just on the mortality, the decision for people who are just making a mathematical assessment of risk-benefit ratio would be very much shifted in favor of being vaccinated. I was recently on a Facebook Live event with a legislator who went to speak about his own experience. He got COVID early on in the pandemic and is trying to get people in his district some information so that, you know, he can help people maybe get comfortable with the vaccination. And he talked about his own issues with long hauling. Now, not only did he have all kinds of issues with his lungs, including lung scarring, but he had this problem where he went back to work and said several weeks in, his shoulder got to be sore and his arm got to be sore. And it was a shoulder that had been replaced years ago. He had been in some kind of a trauma and had an artificial joint in that shoulder. Well, what happened was the artificial joint became very infected. Why? Because he was on steroids for a month post-COVID because of his lungs. And you always have some infinitesimal amount of bacteria around an artificial joint. It's just that your immune system can deal with it, whatever amount can get out into the tissue or into the bloodstream. Well, once you go on steroids, your immune system gets very suppressed. Well, he developed a raging infection and is going to need a complete revision of that shoulder, not to mention all the occupational therapy and physical therapy that goes with it, pain, whatever. And none of that would have happened if he hadn't gotten COVID. So there's all kinds of stories like that. And then there's the usual stuff, which is long-term coughing, chronic bronchitis, chronic lung scarring. I know people who are diabetic since they've had COVID. There's heart inflammation. Yes, you hear about some of that in young males with the vaccine. It tends to be pretty benign in young males and self-limiting and responsive to treatment. But there are athletes who have died on the field after going back, quote unquote, recovered from COVID because they had some heart inflammation. So, I think there's this tendency to just fend off the wolves at the door, dealing with the most egregious consequences of a disease, and that would be death. But unfortunately, it distracts from the overwhelming morbidity of this disease. And I tried to make that a real focus when I was on the panel in this particular discussion with healthcare providers, because it's just very misleading, in my opinion, to do the analysis by comparing the mortality rate of the vaccine with the mortality rate of the disease. In fact, I watch Dr. Bean's show quite often. I don't catch him live because he's on a different time zone than I am, but he had Dr. Paul Marik, who I respect greatly, on that show. And Dr. Paul Marik is probably the most experienced person in this country using ivermectin with COVID patients, and is one of the founders of the FLCCC Alliance. And I did hear him say something that it really irked me, where he said you have to weigh the mortality rate of the vaccine against the mortality rate of the disease. And yeah, I couldn't disagree more. I think it's time to shift the conversation to morbidity. Okay, a third issue that came up in the webinar that I felt very strongly about responding to, and did so, was that I hear people say that, this disease is becoming less deadly. The mortality rate now is much lower than the mortality rate when it got started. And so the assumption is that means then, that is evidence that this virus is behaving like most natural viruses, which might become more infectious, but become also more benign. Yeah, no, because if you see who's infected with the Delta variant and who's in the hospital with the Delta variant, you would know that this thing is in some ways just becoming more dangerous to the unvaccinated population than the original variants treated the then unvaccinated population at that time. And the reason I think we're seeing a lower mortality rate is just because the people who are the most at risk for mortality anyway are the elderly. And the elderly population is the most vaccinated demographic. The fact that we see a lower mortality rate now than we did earlier on in the pandemic does not by any means mean that the disease is less threatening. And then, of course, I could get all on into the whole discussion I just had about morbidity, but that's a whole other story. The reason that we see a lower mortality rate is because the people who are the most vulnerable to mortality to begin with are the most vaccinated demographic. There was another question that came up in the webinar that has come up actually here on my channel. A few people have written to me about this, and I'm not an authority on this issue, but I will tell you what I've read and I'll tell you my thoughts. The question has to do with people who are immunosuppressed or people who have been through chemotherapy and cancer, or maybe organ transplantation. What do you do? Or alternatively, people who have had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and now we're worried because it's less protective against the Delta variant. What do you do? So I'll speak about these two things separately. First of all, in the case of people who are immunocompromised, immunosuppressed, have had organ transplants and things like that, I think this is already now becoming pretty widespread because in Israel, they've already started offering those people a third shot. Now, this is not an unprecedented thing. I have looked back in literature and read even about flu vaccines in the past, that people who are immunocompromised don't tend to mount a really good immune response to one flu shot, and all flu shots, as far as I know, are just one shot. They're not a series. But that's been studied, and if you go ahead and give them another dose, that's enough for them to get to their antibodies to the level where they are protected. So it stands to reason that the same thing would be the case for a COVID vaccine. And in fact, the Israelis are giving a third shot now to anybody who wants one, who is immunosuppressed, immunocompromised, organ transplanted for whatever reason. And if it were me, I would be discussing that with my doctor. So as usual, I'm not giving individual medical advice on this channel. Nothing that I say should be deemed a substitute for the advice of your own practitioner, but I would be talking to my own practitioner if I fell into any one of those categories, because I would very much want a third shot of my messenger RNA vaccine. Now, for people who have just taken Johnson & Johnson and they're thinking, oh, well, maybe I got the wrong shot. I'm not a fan of Johnson & Johnson. I've said it before. I did a video a while back about J&J. I will link it right here. I've become even less a fan than I was back then. But okay, maybe you had the J&J shot for whatever reason, but now you're a little bit concerned because it's less effective against the Delta variant. And yes, it is. So I did read an article where a group of experts got together and decided to go ahead and try themselves to just have a dose of Pfizer. I don't think it was Moderna. I think they used Pfizer. I think they're cross-referenceable, however. And these are people who had had the AstraZeneca vaccine. So it's not the Johnson & Johnson, but it is similar, a platform. Those are both vector vaccines. And they found that adding, after the 2 doses of AstraZeneca, then adding sometime later the 1 dose of Pfizer, they found that they actually did get a really good immune response, and it was very protective. So again, I have written to people here in the comments section who asked about this. If I had received the J&J vaccine, I would be talking to my provider about being allowed to get 1 shot of a Pfizer vaccine or Moderna. That's what I would do. That's just me. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if any of this was helpful. Let me know if it raises any other questions, and I'll do a different video at some point with some QA. In the meantime, I am going to bring Juan Suarez back, Dr. Suarez, to talk again about where we are at the pandemic. So if you can think in advance of any questions that you might have that I might be able to weave into my interview with him, go ahead and put those in the comments section. And until next time, be well. Bye-bye.